Hello everyone, I'm Frank Garza with Lean Startup Company, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Today's topic is how to turn data and metrics into the right kind of action, and moderating the discussion is our own Lean Startup Company faculty lead, Marilyn Gorman. Our guest is author, professional speaker, and consultant, Mark Graban. In Marilyn and Mark's conversation, they discuss why you shouldn't react equally to every uptick or downturn in a business metric, how to distinguish between signal and noise in metrics and respond accordingly, which includes not overreacting, how to use process behavior charts to make better management decisions, and much, much more. So with that, I'll hand things off to Marilyn.
Well, hi, Mark. It is so great to see you today. Thanks so much for joining me for this webcast. I'm really excited to have the conversation with you. But I have to tell you, Mark, you're looking pretty good today. It seems like there's something different than when we saw you last year at the Lean Startup Conference in San Francisco.
Yeah, you're too kind. I would say maybe more different than good. But I shaved this morning shaved fully for the first time in about 15 years because some coworkers of mine are joining the annual Movember fundraiser for men's health awareness and promotion. So I'm going to be growing a mustache this month. That's not a bad decision.
It's like starting with a whole new frame of reference, I'm sure.
I can't do the thoughtful, but it feels weird.
It doesn't look the same. Anyway, it looks great. So let's get started. Mark, you've written this book, Measures of Success, React Less, Lead Better, and Improve More. And what was your motivation behind writing this book?
Well, I've seen, in over 20 years working at first manufacturing companies and then a software company and then working with different healthcare organizations and also being involved with the startup the last 7 years. There's certain patterns and trends of how organizations display metrics, how they react to metrics, because everybody's got goals and objectives and targets, and there's a lot of the action or reaction or maybe even overreaction that occurs every time there's an up and down in metrics, and people feel like they're taking action, but it might not always be the right action. And so, I wrote the book to try to help people out in different industries. I think, Eric Ries talks a lot about avoiding vanity metrics. And that's a really important question, looking at what to measure. But then once we decide what to measure, I think there are also some ways where we could avoid improvement theater, to kind of borrow and adapt one of Eric's other phrases. Are we trying to make it look like things are improving, or are we really looking at metrics in a way that helps us determine, with some simple statistical methods, is it the appearance of improvement, or is it really statistically valid improvement? Those are things that I've seen be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's something that is critically important with the kind of industrial companies that I've worked with too. While they may say they're taking a long-term approach, they're also running quarter to quarter and based on those quarter to quarter numbers. And I suspect we'll come back to that point in a little bit. But what I also loved about your book is its simplicity. I'm not a numbers nerd. And so I loved your starting point of these three core questions. Are we achieving our target or not? Are we improving, and how do we improve? But again, I've often seen leaders, and I suspect you have as well, leaders don't trust simplicity. They think it has to be something more complicated, more difficult. So how have you helped your customers recognize that straightforward is sometimes better to get to the truth of those metrics?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big challenge. There can oftentimes be elegance in simplicity. I mean, I think that's part of the appeal of the broader lean methodology, where roots in lean manufacturing. I think the lean startup movement may have people look at it and say, well, that's simple. We want complex approaches to analyzing problems. And, I think we can try to help show people what's possible. And, I think, the lean startup movement and its emphasis on experiments. We can adapt to build, measure, learn cycle. There's people who've read my book who said, okay, I'm really excited. I want to try these methods, but my leaders are happy with the way we're doing things now. That's we instead of pushing, I've tried to learn through my career, there's a certain psychology that happens when you go pushing ideas, no matter how well-intended or how valid, people tend to push back. I'm sure this happens. People read The Startup Way and go back to their big corporation and say, we need to do an internal lean startup. And the executives might say, well, no, the way we do things, the way we try to innovate is fine. So, there's times where people have just gone and tried to do some examples, take some of the data that the organization's looking at and maybe overreacting to, not just quarterly, but maybe they're overreacting weekly, and, convert 2 data point comparisons, right? I get these emails from Google Analytics every month. Your web traffic is up 12%. What is that a meaningful, is that noise in the metric, or is it a meaningful signal? So when you take your data, plot it as a run chart or a line chart, and then calculate using this process behavior chart methods, there's some simple math to calculate from your baseline data, something we call natural process limits, kind of above and below the average of where a chart is running. Sometimes just seeing that visualization is really eye-opening to people because, I was fortunate to have been exposed to this methodology very early in my career. And sometimes when you show people, compare and contrast, here's the way we're visualizing our metrics now, here's a different way, sometimes that's really eye-opening. And, so sometimes just trying a test of change, building an example, trying to build some stories. I know people who have gone and, seen some initial benefit from using these methods and show that to their leaders, that might spark more interest. So those are some of the things I've tried.
It sounds like, and I apologize if I interrupted you, it sounds
right.
like you could also be doing this in parallel. In other words, what's the harm if you try to run your standard metrics and then apply your methodology to see what can you learn? Does it help you to get a better perspective on what those numbers are actually telling you? Because there's a saying I like a lot, which is common sense isn't always common practice. And so if we can help people think about things in a simple way, which makes them easier to understand, we're more likely to get some learning from that.
Yeah.
But to come back to that point, so many leaders, so many companies are focusing on quarter to quarter, or to your point, even shorter term metrics. So what makes it a problem for them to overreact to every up and down metric? We need to push for continual improvement. We want to feel like we're moving ahead. So what's the problem here?
So I think the problem is when leaders, react to every up and down in a metric, when they ask people to go do a root cause analysis for every data point that's worse than average. There are these different rules of thumb where, sure, ideally you want to see a metric going up every single time period.
Yeah.
The reality oftentimes, though, is a metric is just fluctuating around an average. Now, that could be a flat horizontal average. A metric like customer acquisition rate could be fluctuating around an average of 40%. Or we might have a growth trajectory where the number of inbound leads through our website is increasing at a roughly linear rate, but the metric is now fluctuating around that growth trajectory. So when we use statistical methods to look at this variation, and there's variation in every metric. It's a question of how much variation is there normally. When we ask for explanations or a root cause for every up and down, we're missing the opportunity to better dedicate our time to situations when there is a statistically meaningful signal in the data. And if we have a metric that is fluctuating and it's all essentially noise in the metric, and we need to improve. Well, there are ways of going about that. I think the reactive approach, that asked for, a 5 whys analysis for every single data point. If a metric's just fluctuating and we need to boost average performance, we're probably not going to find the answers to that in the reactive what happened last week questioning. So we can step back and be more systematic. And this is where the broader lean methodology gives us problem-solving methodologies, sometimes called A3 thinking, or Toyota-based problem-solving methods that go a little bit beyond a 5 whys methodology to really kind of help us try to improve a system instead of just reacting to a data point.
Yeah. Well, that makes perfect sense. Just thinking about it myself from a more personal perspective too, this takes a little bit of self-awareness on the part of the leaders to be considering, am I overreacting? And also I see a risk here sometimes is when people do overreact, often the first response is also, who do I blame? What are we doing wrong?
Right.
Is it the customers? Is it my sales team? Is it manufacturing? What is it? So how can leaders know if they are overreacting to their metrics?
Yeah, so the first thing we do, as I mentioned earlier, is literally just plot the dots. There's a group in England that are actually more healthcare based, in the National Health Service there. And when they share things on Twitter about methodologies like this, they use a hashtag plot the dots. So I love that phrase. First, plot the dots, draw a chart. When we visualize data, we can start to see, does it look like there's a trend? Does it look like there's been an upward shift in performance? Or is it just fluctuating? But then we can apply, as I mentioned earlier, we can add 3 other lines to the chart. We can draw an average. And a lot of times you see a metric is just fluctuating. Guess what? Roughly half the data points are above average, half the data points are below average. Or again, if we've got an increasing trend, half the data points might be above the trend and half might be below the trend. So sometimes that alone gives insight. When people say, well, okay, I see the longer term trend, to your point from earlier, let's not overreact to the short term fluctuation or noise. But then we draw 2 other lines, the lower and upper natural process limits, as they're called. So, people in lean and lean startup and other methodologies talk about the voice of the customer. A chart like this is what we call the voice of the process. And the process is telling us, based on our baseline data and how much it tends to fluctuate, those lower and upper limits are calculated in a way that helps us determine sort of a range of expected variation. So now we can apply some rules that are based in statistics and probability where we don't have to guess if it's a signal. There's basically 3 rules we use. If you see a single data point above or below those limits, that's very, very unlikely to statistically randomly occur. That's what we call a signal that there's either been a shift in the system or we've perhaps done something intentionally to change the system. And seeing that data point that's significantly higher helps us in our hypothesis testing. A second rule is to look for 8 consecutive data points that are either above or below the baseline average. So I think there's a trap people fall into where they make a change to a system. They look at the next data point's result and say, okay, we made a change, the performance is better. We'll pat ourselves on the back and we think we've proved that it improves, but that uptick might have been just within the range of routine variation. But now if we see not 4, not 6, but 8 consecutive data points, that would be a statistically valid signal that says we've shifted performance. And then there's a third rule, it's a little more esoteric, looking at a cluster of data points that are closer to a limit than they are to the average. But I think one of the keys here is that, a couple of keys is that the math is simple, the methodology is visual, and again, it helps leaders filter out, okay, that's just noise. That doesn't mean we can't improve the system. But when there's a signal, that's when it's worth reacting and asking what happened. And to your point, not asking who, not punishing or blaming somebody, for that change. You know, we really need to look at things from a systems perspective, and this methodology helps us do that.
Well, and it is so aligned with the lean startup approach because data is king. And in this instance, we're using data to make smart decisions, even if those decisions are do nothing, because the data is not yet telling you that there's enough of a signal there
right.
to make a change.
Yeah, and the data might be, the chart might be telling you to do, it might be telling you do nothing, or it might be telling you take a step back, take a breath, think systemically, instead of that sort of knee-jerk continual reaction. But there was a funny line somebody said when we were talking about the book, and they said, well, they said their organization was data-driven, but the problem is they only use 2 data points. And so there's data-driven, and then there's really data-driven, where I try to encourage people, don't think of, you know, back to the first question you mentioned earlier, are we hitting our goal? Mm-hmm. Instead of looking at individual data points, look at the longer term trend, and if there's an average level of performance, you know, we can evaluate against the target that way. And instead of overreacting to every up and down, again, try to do things that shift the average level of performance up, or maybe we can shrink variation in performance.
Sure. Yeah. Again, makes perfect sense. So up till now, our listeners may have felt like we were talking about large enterprises. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how you can apply this thinking in practice for a startup that could be considerably smaller?
Yeah, so I've been involved with a startup company called KaiNexus. In fact, it's grown enough, maybe it's now just a small company that's still growing quickly. But a couple of years ago, we would have team meetings, and everyone was kind of reporting out, and the marketing director, she would always report numbers like web traffic and leads, and she would say things like, well, the number was higher than it was last week, or that number is above average. And sometimes if the answer was, well, the website traffic is down, and our CEO, not in a blamey, judgmental way, I think he was just asking questions. He would ask, well, Maggie, do you know why traffic was down? And she'd say, I don't know, but let me go look into it. And so then, I finally clued in. It took me a little while. I'm like, well, wait a minute. We're just talking about 2 data point comparisons. Some weeks it's up, some weeks it's down. When the week is up, nobody's really asking why was traffic up. But the punchline of the story is that there was really no reason either way. The number, when we plotted it and looked at it, was really just fluctuating. Mm-hmm. There was an average level of web traffic. There was an average number of what they call tier 1 leads. And so we charted it, and Maggie and Greg, the CEO, started trying to practice this new behavior. And Maggie, here was the time savings kicked in. So Maggie, how much time would you spend digging into the Google Analytics and other analytical tools? And she said, I'd probably spend an hour, maybe more, to come up with really no clear answer, because there was no root cause for those changes. So over time, what I encouraged her was, well, now that you're not doing that research, and now that the CEO is not asking you to do that research, you could spend that time in a more productive way. So she was going out and creating more content and doing other things that would improve that system, increase traffic, increase conversion rates. She was working on the system instead of cooking up answers for the fluctuation. Well, then we started seeing in the chart, we started seeing a trend upward. And we started seeing, okay, now we've got 8 data points above the old average. The system has improved. And that wasn't happening in that sort of reactive cycle. It freed up time and put the focus, I think, where it should have been. Then we started seeing for a while, it was increasing linearly with some of that fluctuation. Mm-hmm. And then it went into a period where it again flattened out. But Greg, the CEO, and Maggie, the marketing director, and others within our team have really come to believe in this methodology, because I think everything they were doing in the past had been well intended, but it just wasn't as effective as it could have been.
Yeah. Well, and again, you're raising a great alignment with Lean Startup, which is stop wasting time doing things that are not adding value.
Yeah.
And if you're tracking numbers in too short a period, where's the value? Because it's not telling you what you need to know.
Yeah.
So can you use this approach to evaluate a hypothesis that you might have about how you could improve results? Because when I'm thinking, when Maggie started working on those other things, perhaps even though it may not have been articulated, she had an idea that if we do some of these activities, it'll add value to our process.
Yeah. So, sometimes the process behavior charts help you detect there's a signal. You discover that, let's say, new user sign up rates are down dramatically one day. Well, somebody might not have noticed that some sort of API, I'm not real technical, but some sort of API or something in the website was broken and nobody had discovered that yet.
Yeah.
So sometimes a signal causes you to react and go put things back to where they were. But then there are times when we're intentionally framing an improvement hypothesis, where we make a change, and then, like I said earlier, instead of reacting or looking for one or two data points. No, one data point, if it's a big jump, that might be a signal. But a lot of times, we see a jump, a small, medium uptick, and people might declare victory too soon, or they may give up on a change too quickly.
Okay.
And there's other dynamics, or sometimes around learning curves, or sometimes when you institute a change, a metric gets worse before it gets better. But the process behavior chart methodology, allows people to look for these signals of either the real quick and large effect when the data jumps quickly, or to say, well, we've made a small jump where the single data point wasn't a signal, but now we have those 8 consecutive data points that tell us we've actually shifted performance. So that, I think, helps strengthen people's cause and effect thinking. We've made a change, now let's evaluate that hypothesis in a statistically valid way. That's certainly one way to use this methodology. And then there's a challenge, though, sometimes where there's the improvement story people want to tell, and then there's the story the data is actually telling. And there are times, unfortunately, where inadvertently or intentionally we can massage the data, or we can cherry pick numbers to make it look like we're improving. But I think it falls into that category where if you're really only fooling yourself, or you're only hurting yourself if you don't take that honest view of if we haven't improved, then we need to continue working on the system instead of, again, I'll use Eric's success theater.
Exactly. Just what
I don't want improvement theater.
Yeah. No, we want to avoid success theater at all costs. And so what about when you're not meeting your goals and objectives, but your process is or your system is pretty stable and predictable? How does this apply then?
Well, so, when you talk about a predictable system, a metric that's just fluctuating within those limits, the bad news might be it's not reaching our goals and objectives. The good news is, well, at least it's predictable. So, nobody has a crystal ball, but let's say we have a metric that is performing well, before coming back to the improvement question. If we have a metric that's performing well and it's predictable, we could probably sleep well at night that system is going to continue. A predictable system tends to remain predictable until something changes, and the charts can help us detect when something has changed so we can react perhaps before we dip below our goal. So that's one way we can use it. But if we're not performing where we need to be, I think this is where, like we've talked about already, there's that opportunity to step back and be systematic. How do we boost the average performance of the system? Again, I think is a different question than what went wrong last month, or let's say if we had a bit of an uptick. What was different last month? Well, maybe the answer is nothing. And so I think this mindset of learning how to distinguish between noise and signal, using a little bit of math and using the visual charts, I think that helps people, again, make tighter connections between things we're doing to try to improve the system and the actual performance of the system, so that we can, I think just have better learning and more improvement.
Yeah, and I think, I take your point about better learning, which is really what we're trying to use metrics for, to learn, to use past history as a way of considering what do we need to do in the future to get better, to your point, to help improve, and how can we improve.
Yeah.
But this is a struggle, and it's a struggle for a lot of startups, and even for enterprises who just have difficulty with defining metrics and then staying with the plan. We so often hear that, and it's true that lean startup is about moving faster, but I also hear you say you have to have the patience to not react to every single thing that you're seeing from week to week.
Yeah,
so,
I think patience and sometimes discipline and, more frequent metrics, I think, are a good thing, because again, if we're looking for those 8 consecutive data points that indicate a shift in performance, 8 days, if we have a daily metric, 8 days is better than waiting 8 months.
Yes.
But this methodology, because there will be more day-to-day variation in most every metric, the way we calculate those limits scales to prevent us from overreacting to changes in the daily metrics. And it helps us prove cause and effect in our improvement hypothesis more quickly if we have a daily or, let's say, a weekly metric.
Yeah. So let me bring this to a close today, Mark, by asking you what advice or encouragement do you have for these enterprises or startups who really struggle with how can I measure, how can I know what's happening, how can I do that consistently?
Yeah, I guess I would ask people to reflect a little bit on some of their current practices. Are they looking at tables of numbers? Are they reporting out 2 data point comparisons? And if so, what happens when you visualize the data as a run chart, or Excel calls it a line chart? Sometimes that simple practice can be helpful. From a reaction standpoint, kind of reflect on, are we reacting in this really binary way? Well, let's say if we're better than goal, we label that green. If we're worse than goal, we label it red. So sometimes there's just this binary. If it's green, hooray, good, nothing to look at. Red, bad, do a root cause analysis. That's not always the most helpful way of reacting. So, I would say, draw a chart, see what the voice of the process tells you. You might not like what the voice of the process is saying, but I think that to me, there's connections here with lean startup approaches. We need to look at our data and our performance honestly.
Yes.
And, the voice of the process will often point us in the right direction of, do we improve in kind of a quick reaction mode, or can we step back and be more systematic? I would encourage people. Hopefully people can give this a try, and I'm looking for more reports and examples where I think within startups, I think within venture capital firms, looking at metrics and reports from portfolio companies. I'd be curious to see what people try and learn.
I think that's an excellent idea, and I really appreciate you calling up the actual words that I had in my own head, which was, this is about being honest, again, being a little bit self-aware, having the courage to say, I don't think that we're looking at this in the right way. And anybody in a team has the opportunity to say that.
Yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really interesting, and I am not a numbers person, so I don't say that very often.
The biggest, the praise I was really happy to get, there's a friend of mine who does lean work in different types of service companies and sometimes manufacturing. Yeah. And this is his words. No offense to English majors at all. He said, I'm an English major. I would never pick up a book about math or statistics, but he said it was understandable, it was enjoyable, and he's been applying some of these methods with his clients. And, I think a lot of times people get scared off by the real hardcore statistical analysis that we were taught in a university setting. Yep. This methodology is applicable, if not more valid in the real world. And it's something I think everyone can use. So I would encourage people, even if you don't think you're a numbers person, to give this a try, because I think we're all visual, and looking at charts, far more visual for people than a list of numbers.
Yeah. Well, we can't ask for any more than that. Thank you again, Mark.
Thank you, Marilyn.